Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another worst to best ranking. Alright, it's finally time to send off this very long series on the legendary 70s synth pioneer band Tangerine Dream. I've made videos on their first 16 main studio albums and covered a load of other things in that gigantic odds and ends video, chronicled their rise to fame in the experimental krautrock and Berlin school ambient circuit, getting progressively more accessible and melody-centric over the years, and putting out loads of game-changing classics and giant nostalgia-heavy favorites for those who are around to see them in their biggest commercial heights in the early 80s, only to lean so far into their most commercial tendencies so as to nearly ruin their legacy and become not really worth following anymore for most people past whatever applicable point was too selloutish for any given fan. Eventually becoming way more about quantity over quality, with over 100 studio albums released in total over the course of their entire history, most of which I have not bothered to listen to out of not looking like anything all that interesting. They've just got decades of middle-of-the-road creative stagnation. Still, despite the state they eventually ended up in, there is a good reason that they remain such a recognizable and influential name in the world of electronic music that I wanted to highlight in such a series like this in the first place. And so, as has become the tradition for my discography reviews, I'll be capping off this series with an album ranking that celebrates the actual good parts of their history, and sort of briefly summarizes this whole series in an easier-to-digest package. I obviously will not be doing a top 10 tracks video, since so many of this band's tracks, especially in their peak period, are just like full album sides on albums that would likely be presented as a single track if not for the limitations of vinyl records, which kind of defeats the purpose of such a list. Additionally, of course, this ranking will only be including the peak period records that cover that span of time which this series is focused on, from their initial formation through to my personal cutoff point at their 1986 album Underwater Sunlight. So that will include those first 16 studio albums that I made proper reviews of. And also as a bonus, by popular demand from comments, I've decided to also include the 5 live albums they released in this period in the ranking as well, for a total of 21 albums. I will not be counting soundtrack albums, such as Sorcerer or Thief or any of those. And I will not be counting anything that released after Underwater Sunlight. Some might find the album that came out right after that, called Tiger from 1987, to be a more natural cutoff point, as that was the last album to still have contributions from longtime core member Christopher Franke. I decided not to include it here to keep this video consistent with how I've presented the rest of my series on this band, and I decided not to dedicate a full video review to that album because I wanted to end the series on a positive note. If I were to include Tiger in this ranking, it would rank in dead last by a long shot, and most of the other albums that came out right after that would also rank lower than what I have at my bottom pick. If you want albums that I'd actually recommend after the 1986 cutoff point, I thought Mars Polaris from 1999 held up pretty well, probably still gonna hang on to that. And I was a lot happier with the results of the 2 posthumous albums, Quantum Gate and Realm, than I was expecting to be. If you want full thoughts on any of that stuff, just make sure to watch the Odds and Ends video. I did put a lot of work into that. But yeah, this video is just covering the peak period stuff from 1970 to 1986. And here's the usual disclaimers that this is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. I feel like that might be particularly worth keeping in mind for this band, since whatever your jumping on point for them happen to be is likely to heavily inform which albums of theirs mean the most to you. And there's a lot of widely varied opinions from fans on every single one of their albums. There's not a single one universally agreed upon to be top tier for them, besides possibly Phaedra. I have my own nostalgia biases and preferences towards certain projects in their catalog that will not be shared equally by all fans. It is, of course, worth noting that I am only in my late 20s as of recording this, and every single one of the projects I'll be talking about in this video came out long before I was born, if that happens to matter to you. My point is that everyone's rankings are going to be completely different and are even likely to include or exclude different albums, and I can only speak for myself for this video. Also, do not hold me to these rankings that much. They are not set in stone. My opinion is very liable to change. A lot of these placements have rapidly switched around depending on my mood, and several placements have ended up very different from how I expected them to go back when I reviewed these albums. At the end of the day, this ranking is purely based on what I personally enjoy the most and what I would most see myself wanting to come back to as of the time I've recorded and edited this video. I might even feel differently after I post the video, you never really know, but yeah, with all of that out of the way, let's finally get into it. This is Tangerine Dream, Worst to Best, 1970 to 1986. And number 21, I have Lay Park. Yeah, I didn't have to think too hard about this placement. This album is their first really obvious sellout move that would set the tone for how they would handle the rest of the later 80s. Not sellout as in a turn for the more pop-friendly and accessible. They'd already done that a couple of times and had gone over much better before. I mean sellout as in leaning so far into mainstream accessibility so as to lose the core appeal of what made those older projects good in the first place. Even if many of the tunes are at least mildly catchy and I can recall what they sound like, the sound palette and arrangements are so cheesy and dated to that specific time in 1985. Every synth tone and drum machine could be heard in any number of mainstream pop singles charting at the time, complete with even a few background vocal appearances which only served to make the sound feel even more generic. And that's not even in the moments where the arrangements get kinda lazy to the point of ripping their old stuff off, mainly the opener sounding like it's copying from their track Pilots of Purple Twilight and doing it worse. Now again, if you go later than 1986 in this band's catalog, you can find plenty of even worse material than this. Tiger, Lily on the Beach, Melrose, Raccoon, all worse than Lay Park. This album at least has the benefit of having hooks and tunes I can remember, and the further you get into the later Tangerine Dream catalog, the less often you will find projects with the ability to even clear that bar. If all-instrumental 80s pop so plain and run-of-the-mill so as to appeal to Patrick Bateman's sensibility sounds like the kind of thing you'd enjoy, then by all means give it a shot. I don't think it's terrible or even outright bad, as it is just mid. But it is definitely the least fun I've had listening to any of the 21 albums included in this video, and I'd more recommend sticking to something like Jean-Michel Jarre's Rendezvous if you're in the mood for this kind of thing. Whoopsh. At number 20, I have White Eagle. And first major hot take. I know loads of people love this album, but I personally think it's only decent and not essential. I will have to say making the Odds and Ends video definitely helped me appreciate all the elements of Tangerine Dream's core appeal, which rapidly disappeared later in the decade but still remain on this album. It still sticks to their recognizable signature sound. I still distinctly remember what each of the 4 tracks sounds like, and they do still add up to that trademark retro-futurist vibe that they've always been so good at cultivating. Coming back to this after having that much fuller image in my mind of how bad this band could get allowed this album to grow on me a decent bit. And if I were crazy enough to rank every single one of their studio albums, I feel like there's a good chance this would still be closer to the top in the grander scheme of their entire history. But I would still say it's a less good version of ideas they'd already done on previous classic albums, and there's nothing here that really makes it stand out in my mind compared to the classics that immediately surrounded it. The arrangements are all pretty skeletal and simplistic, the tunes are fine but not outstanding. I've seen other people talk about the material on here hitting them on a deeper emotional level, and really only the title track comes close to doing that for me. For the most part, it's once again just kind of plain and not the most interesting, and if one is to listen to their albums in chronological order, this will be the first album of theirs to not represent any kind of step forward for them, neither introducing any new approaches or refining any older ones, but instead just doing exactly what you would expect out of them at that point with no twist. This band may have much less interesting projects, and I've come around on this one enough to get why it means as much to certain sects of the fan base as it does, but it still never really meant much to me, and I won't personally be keeping it around. Whoopsh. At number 19, I have Electronic Meditation. Well, in stark contrast to the previous 2 placements, nobody can say that TD's debut isn't at least interesting. Not only did it feature something of a supergroup lineup with the band then consisting of Edgar Fruze, Klaus Schultz, and Konrad Schnitzler, which would immediately dissolve right after this album released. But it's also radically different from anything else the band ever did. It's way more of an experimental rock project in the same vein as their krautrock contemporaries, with surprisingly almost nothing in the way of actual electronics or synthesizers. And there's also almost nothing in the way of traditional melodies or tunes either. It's just pure psychedelic experimental jam sessions in the style of Kraftwerk's first two self-titled albums, or the title track from Pink Floyd's A Saucerful of Secrets. Being so much less traditionally listenable than anything else in the band's catalog does unsurprisingly lead to this being a very divisive one among fans, and I've seen many call it outright terrible or like it shouldn't even count as a real album. Some people have tried to tell me that the album was even released by the label without the band's permission, though I have found zero confirmation of that, and I've even read interviews from Edgar talking about this album with mostly fond memories, so I think I can probably dismiss that rumor. I definitely understand how so many find it to be so distasteful, but assuming you actually have a stomach for experimental krautrock like this, it's perfectly fine for what it is, and I even think it's pretty decent. I'd even say the first half is pretty good, with a lot of interesting off-the-wall and occasionally epic progressions, even if the second half trails off and cycles through a bunch of the same sounds from the first half before ending rather anticlimactically. I might actually say I got more out of this than either of those first two Kraftwerk albums, Discount and Kling Klang. But I'll also admit my thoughts on it very much sit within the same ballpark as Kraftwerk's first two albums, what with how out there and intentionally unpleasant and jarring it's trying to be, and how it doesn't come close to playing to any of these artists' typical strengths. At best, it's a curiosity that I very much have to be in the right mood for, and I would be lying if I said I found any of it preferable to most of their peak period catalog. I'm highly unlikely to keep it around after putting up this video just out of not really being a fun listen. But I do respect it, and I don't think it deserves to be just dismissed out of hand. I might not enjoy it in the traditional sense, but something weird like this is still preferable over yet another set of generic stock 80s instrumentals. Whoopee. At number 18, I have Encore. Okay, next big hot take. Here we have my easy least favorite of the peak period live albums. In one breath, this does have all the epic synth progressions and experimental jam session flares that the earlier Peter Baumann era, which this came from, also has. A vibe shared by albums like Ricochet and Stratosphere. However, I will have to say, most of the times I personally put this on, I kinda just found the experience to be more monotonous than anything, and not as interesting or hypnotizing as their other projects in the same style. Sure, it's epic, it's propulsive, Edgar has a lot of kick-ass guitar solos, the whole last side, Desert Dream, focuses a lot more on that more experimental and abstract sound from the days before they signed to Virgin. It's all cool, probably still easier to like than Electronic Meditation on the merits of sticking to that classic trademark TD sound we all know and love, and coming right from when they were in their prime doing it. But it's also a 70-minute double album, most of which just kinda drags and runs together. There's not a ton in the way of interesting progressions, and the track that I think has the most progression, Monolight, is mainly notable for directly repurposing melodies from other projects of theirs, like Stratosphere and the Sorcerer soundtrack, and in such a way that doesn't leave the same impact as when I hear those melodies in their original context. Not to mention the sound quality of this project isn't really the greatest. It's got kind of a lo-fi feel to it that makes all of it feel a little underweight. If you're the kind of person who was less impressed by the direction the band went in after Peter Baumann left and prefers to stick to that sound when he was still on board and just get a lot of it, then I can see this being more of a favorite for you. Maybe this is going to be another case like when I said I didn't really care for Jean-Michel Jarre's Chronology and put that near the bottom of my ranking for him, and everyone else told me I was completely crazy for thinking that. But I can't just sit here and lie about my real feelings. I wasn't impressed by this as much as I wanted to. It shrunk on me every time I tried to put it on when I reviewed it for the odds and ends, and I don't see myself coming back to it. Whoopsh. At number 17, I have Green Desert. Okay, I'll have to admit this album shrunk on me a decent bit since my review, but it is the first album in this ranking that I would definitively qualify as good and not just decent or eh. A pretty interesting little one-off moment for the TD catalog. Originally recorded as a demo tape in 1973, used to convince Richard Branson to sign the band to Virgin Records, but never publicly seeing the light of day until getting remixed and seeing a wider release in 1986, and thus providing an interesting combination of their 70s compositional instincts with their 80s production instincts. The novelty of this one did kind of wear off on me after I put together the Odds and Ends video and heard so many other albums, from their live albums to soundtrack albums to Edgar's later solo albums, that all kind of explore similar sounds, and I realized this one might not stand out as much in the grander scheme of their catalog as I might have thought. Even if it's not too difficult to tell apart the 4 tracks on this thing, they do all definitely run together, and it has none of their absolute best moments. But again, it is at least a good album, the clear highlight being the 20-minute title track, which has a lot of forward momentum and does the best job of splitting the difference between their 70s and 80s approaches, and the other 3 tracks still having all their own cool sounds and deserted melodic flares. There may be lots of other TD albums that deliver similar ideas more compellingly, but it's still definitely a fun listen if you happen to be curious about it. And number 16, I have Cyclone. This one, meanwhile, has grown back on me a decent bit since I reviewed it and left me feeling like I may have been too harsh on it in my review, though it's still a really weird one to place. One of the very few Tangerine Dream albums to feature actual singing, short-term member Steve Joliffe came in to provide some squawking vocals and that sort of 70s prog flavor, and once again the results are extremely divisive among fans. I'll still say it's by far the most successful attempt TD ever made to incorporate vocals in their music. Joliffe's shaky prog voice is still much more fitting and flattering for the band's style than the hyper-polished 80s charity single singing on Tiger, or Thorsten Quationing attempting to sing on an album like Undercover. But Cyclone is still kind of an awkward transitional album more than anything, with somewhat hit-and-miss results. Bent Cold Sidewalk's core sections still strike me as a bit too derivative of classic Pink Floyd tracks like Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar. Rising Runner Missed by Endless Ender has a good foot-tapping tune to it, but the weakest and goofiest vocal performances. And the clear highlight is the all-instrumental sidelong epic Madrigal Meridian, which provides plenty more propulsion and epic highlights, even if the sound would go on to be significantly improved upon by the album they came out with right after this, Force Majeure. Or for that matter, Edgar Frizz's solo album Ages, which came out around the same time and delivers the same palette of somewhat lo-fi prog rock synth sounds shown here, presented in a far more entertaining and interesting and substantive way. I'll still say Cyclone is a fun listen, all things considered, and once again I don't think it's deserving of the level it hate it often gets. I happily put this one on pretty regularly when I was in high school and found the whole Pink Floyd-ish feel of it to be pretty charming in its own right, but I would be lying if I said it was as easy a project to recommend or come back to compared to a lot of the other classics the band was putting out around the time. Still more of a fun, one-off curiosity than a must-listen. Whoopsh. At number 15, I have Poland. Ah yes, Poland. Now here's one I have a lot of mixed feelings on. Their first album to release after breaking off from Virgin Records and acting as the sort of bridge between that whole era and the more pop-centric Blue Years era. Another expansive live album stretching over 80 minutes. Unlike Encore, this album is hardly lacking in terms of substance or progression. There's always something new coming up around every corner of each one of the side-along tracks, and they're all split up into multiple mini-sections. There's an absolute ton to dig into, from tranquil ambient passages and Hyperborea-style soundscapes with some of the warmest and most emotional moments in their catalog thus far, to aggressive and propulsive synth-pop instrumentals, to other slightly odd but still accessible little experiments. And the sheer amount of substance along with its general consistency makes it that much easier to recommend than a project like Encore. On the other hand, as many different ideas as this album throws at you, I usually get the feeling that all of them are just kind of adding up to the same general pleasant vibe without standing out as much as they possibly could, and I do really feel the length on this one every time I put it on. Not to mention, once again, the recording quality is not the best. It's yet another case of the things I like the most about this album are done even better on other albums, and all of these various issues kind of prevent me from seeing myself wanting to come back to it in comparison with any of the stuff I have ranked higher. At the very least, there's definitely a strong case to be made for someone marking this as one of their absolute favorites in the TD catalog. So, you know, I can't say I love it, but I definitely understand why others do. At number 14, I have Atom. Now we get to an album that's very odd and difficult to place in the greater context of their catalog. I don't really have any other albums that sound quite like it, focusing more on Mellotron sounds than any other previous project of theirs, but maintaining that early experimental prog rock feel, which almost puts it in line with the work of their contemporaries like King Crimson. Later albums would make use of the Mellotron in similar but much more effective ways, and especially hearing Edgar's solo album Epsilon and Malaysian Pale, which hit such a giant home run with its similarly flavored Mellotron excursions, nearly made this totally redundant in comparison, probably sank it in the ranking a decent bit. But even that album doesn't really deliver the same kind of experience that Atom does. Atom is much darker and has much more of a frightening edge to it. It does once again have a bit of a weak ending, and that closer with all the primal yelping and screaming noises never fails to throw me off and unimmerse me from the album's vibe every time. But the 20-minute title track evolving from Ten Commandments-style triumphant biblical epicness into more flavors of spacey ambience, and the 10-minute Fauni Jenna with its Mellotron strings evoking more of a rainforest-ish feeling complete with bird sound effects is all very cool and interesting. Also, I think Circulation of Events grew on me a little despite not introducing any new sounds for the album. Just kind of a neat, spooky vibe to that one. I'm still not entirely sure what to make of this album. Each listen I give it, I seem to come away with completely different feelings each time, varying from impressed to underwhelmed. And I'm admittedly not sure how much I'm going to come back to it in the future. I think I may have overplayed this album a bit in an attempt to fully parse my thoughts in the lead up to this video, which led to it shrinking on me. But out of their first 4 albums, this is probably the most interesting listen and the easiest to recommend to a lay listener. Not to mention the most unique sounding. Very much not the kind of listen I can put on any time, and they were able to improve upon a lot of the ideas on display here later on, but I do have a lot of respect for the groundwork it helped set for those albums, how it effectively combined the things that worked on their previous 3 albums, and how it does stand out as a sort of bizarre black sheep in their catalog. It's cool. I like it. Whoopsh. At number 13, I have Quixote, aka Pergamon. Okay, next live album to go through. This is another weird one to quantify since it very much acts as a direct companion to their Tangram album, and a lot of the first side in particular is focused on repurposing different sections of that album. I may love Tangram, we'll get to that later in this video, and hearing these different takes on those same musical passages is cool, but listening to this obviously isn't preferable to hearing it in their original context. Now the real reason this album ended up this high in the ranking is purely because of the second side, which taken on its own may very well be the single most epic and propulsive piece this band has ever released, at least up there with like Force Majeure. It just needs to be heard to be believed, the way all its hard-hitting arpeggios and drum machines and soaring melodies just keep rising higher and higher and hitting you with more and more new hooks that keep feeling like they're raising the stakes even further as you go along. It is such a trip, and the album is absolutely worth going out of your way for just for that second side alone. As a full album, I can't say Pergamon is the most essential thing the band has ever done, and all the repurposed material makes it difficult for the project to rise above being a really cool side curiosity. It's basically the kind of thing that works great if you take the album as like a regular old traditional live album. I mean, it's a concert I would have loved to have seen, maybe even selling me on the experience more than other live albums I have ranked higher. But the reason I've included TD's live albums in the ranking in the first place is because of their rare ability to completely stand on their own as individuals, and this doesn't really do that as much. Not a better starting point than the album it's adding on to, but if nothing else, I know I'm going to keep that second half close to me for a long time. Whoopsh. At number 12, I have Alpha Centauri. Next up, we've reached the exact midpoint of the ranking with what is by far the biggest and most unexpected upset for me. Back when I was still writing the odds and ends video, I was fully expecting this album to occupy the space in this ranking around where Green Desert currently is, and talk about how it was a nice early effort that would first set the tone for what TD's real strengths were, including more actual synthesizers and focusing almost entirely on cosmic ambient drones, though still showing these ideas in a more primitive form not yet fully realized. But the longer I spent on this ranking comparing albums to each other, I started to realize that I found this album easy enough to come back to and replay where I would be okay with continuing to hang on to the whole thing. An honor not shared by any albums ranked lower than this one. Even if it's not nearly as well refined or easily recognizable as the style the band would become known for, they're still going about it with the same mindset and delivering a lot of cool ideas. The way the album builds itself out of organs, live drumming, freakier psychedelic guitar work, and even flutes absolutely set it apart as its own thing. Both of the longer tracks have plenty to pull me into them, be it the more epic and prog-like jamming on Fly and Collision of Coma Sola, which refines all the best parts of their debut in a more digestible package, or the spacier and more abstract ambient explorations of the title track. And I guess the opener, Sunrise in the Third System, is a decent enough intro for the project too. Not to say this album is exactly the best of its kind either. There exist albums like Klaus Schulz's Irrlicht, which delivers a similar idea that can hit me on a more emotional level. But I have definitely softened on this early experimental period for the band for how it really breaks from the norm for them. And Alpha Centauri has held up quite a bit better than I would have expected back when I reviewed it. It does make sense for fans to treat this as the band's real debut of sorts. Probably not recommended as a starting point, but it's worth picking up for sure. But while we're on the topic of possibly unexpected placements, whoopsh, at number 11, I have Underwater Sunlight. Alright, the album I always mark as my cutoff point for the band's peak period. Now, to be fair, this is not really an upset for me. I went into writing this video expecting this album to sit around this spot in the ranking, and it hasn't actually shifted. But I might say it's unexpected because I would have a hard time fully explaining what it is about Underwater Sunlight that's continued to stick with me to the point where it could rank this high in the first place. The actual sound and style of it has more in common with my least favorite TD albums than it does with their more actually celebrated classics. Extremely pop-friendly with an extremely 80s sound palette, maybe even predictive of the new age approach they would start to lean into through the 90s. Though, unlike any of the other albums with Paul Hasslinger on board that started to turn more and more into generic and flavorless 80s background music, Underwater Sunlight still very much has the solid tunes and melodies to back itself up that are easy to remember. It has a warmer and more immersive production style that sounds astronomically better than most of the other albums the band was putting out in this period and afterwards. And more importantly, the compositions feel like they're actually trying to capture a greater sense of grandeur and deeper emotion that albums like Lay Park don't come even close to capturing. Actually evoking that vast underwater setting that the album title promises in such a way that is genuinely refreshing. The two-part Song of the Whale is the easy highlight by far, with the best tunes, the best atmosphere, and the most emotional resonance. Also nice piano solos and yellow oh yeah samples in the second part. But each of the other four smaller tracks can hit upon a solid enough vibe to work in a similar way. It's not an album I'm going to die on a hill for. I'd get it if this wasn't your bag, just like all their other 80s albums that came out after it aren't my bag. But as far as I'm concerned, it's the solitary gem in their late 80s output that's actually worth keeping. And while we're on the topic of albums evoking expansive underwater vibes, whoosh, at number 10, I have Rubicon. Okay, now we're getting into the real classics. Rubicon may not be among my personal favorites of their biggest and most well-known projects. I think the first side is markedly stronger than its second side, and the sonic formulas set by this project were even further improved upon by other projects, hence how it's so low in the ranking for me. But it was easily their best produced project up to this point, and the one that best evoked that grander sense of open space while sticking to the more improvisational side to their sound, floating through experimental ambience and expansive mellotron pads and propulsive bass synth arpeggios that would really become their trademark from this point onwards. Well, more accurately, starting from the album that came right before it and going forwards, but this one really sealed the deal that this formula would be their core signature sound. I don't really have much else to say about it. The album sounds great, it's an easy pick for lots of other people's number one favorites. It's even grown on me a bit since I've reviewed it. I just personally think there exist other albums in their catalog that can hit me on an even deeper level than this and have even more substance to break down. For example, whoosh. At number 9, I have Logos Live. Man, did I sleep on this one in high school. I bet this would have really stuck with me if I'd given it a chance back then. Everything that disappointed me on White Eagle is fully made up for here. This album has lots of great tunes and melodies, especially the whole, Logos Velvet section of the title piece, and the Dominion track tacked on at the end. Loads of interesting progressions and neat, well-detailed sound design excursions, some sections that make more obvious use of their new digital samplers, and some that even incorporate then-modern electro and hip-hop elements in such a way that doesn't feel dated or cringy. And despite being a live album, not a single part of it overlaps with the material on their main studio albums. All of it completely stands on its own. It might not outright eclipse the best studio material they were putting out in this era. Obviously, we'll get to my actual nostalgia buttons with this band in a while. And I suppose the material on display could be criticized for feeling a bit disjointed at times. But if you're at all a fan of any of these classic early 80s TD projects and somehow missed this one like I did, you're gonna want to remedy that real soon. Oh, and speaking of live albums on par with their studio output from a given era, whoopsh. At number 8, I have Ricochet. And here we have my personal favorite of the live albums, at least at this current moment. This album, Logos, and Rubicon could switch around any of their spots in the ranking depending on my mood. But I think I primarily leaned on this one because it's the best example of why these live albums are being included in the ranking in the first place. This is the live album that feels the most like a regular studio album, to the point where I think the most people would get, confused or upset if I were to exclude it. Ricochet may have been a step down production-wise from Rubicon, but compositionally it very much feels like the logical next step forward for the band after that album. Taking a similar mix of propulsive synth sequences and arpeggios and further cranking up the energy level. Where Rubicon could feel like it lost a bit of steam in its second half, this one only continues to escalate over time, starting out strong and ending even stronger with new passages that have kick-ass guitar solos and sections made of mild classical piano and stuff. And where Logos and Rubicon might have individual parts I like more than any individual part of this album, I think this one comes together the strongest as a complete whole. Out of all the live albums this band put out, this is the most important one to hear, and if you skip it, you miss an integral part of the band's history, and a really solid fun time to boot. But on the topic of crucially integral parts of the band's history, whoosh, at number 7, I have Sight. Man, Sight. There is really something special about this one, isn't there? I can't deny historical importance at least partially plays into how high this one ended up ranking. The fact that this album was one of, if not just the very first of its kind, electronically focused ambient records like this just weren't even a thing that existed back when this came out in 1972, which is almost hard to imagine now. But somehow this still feels like the kind of album that could still make perfect sense coming out right now, a quality not shared by any of the other projects the band released before signing to Virgin. It's definitely not the kind of listen that's going to be for everyone. It's 75 minutes of dark ambience evoking the emptiness of space or looking over the edge of a black hole, and there's little to nothing in the way of traditional melody to be found. It's a very difficult and inaccessible listen that at best serves one specific mood, and if you're not in the right headspace to engage with it, then it's probably going to come off as one of the most tedious things ever. Absolutely not an album I would recommend to someone trying to get into ambient music for the first time. But for how empty those 75 minutes are meant to feel, there is definitely something there at the center of it still worth engaging with. A strong emotional core, albeit a particularly bleak one, a constant sense of progression, albeit a very subtle and slow one. I feel like the more times I take the plunge through it, the more I find to latch onto. Even since my review where I said the last quarter of the project was weaker than the first 3, I feel like even that part's grown on me as well. I can understand anyone who hates this project or think it's way overrated, but I personally think the hype for it is deserved. Now, if you're looking for a classic that doesn't have such a high barrier to entry, whoosh. At number 6, I have Force Majeure. Alright, I'll be honest and say the only reason this album isn't ranked even higher is because I don't have quite as much nostalgia for it as I do for any of the projects ranked above it. I think I heard the album a single time with the tracks out of order in high school and barely remembered anything about it before returning to give it my first real listens while working on this series. where I realized how completely wrong my old preconceptions about it were, and how immediately the album absolutely kicked ass the very second I came back to it. This has to be the album that does the best job of combining TD's typical progressive synth formulas with their roots in regular prog rock, with melodies that vaguely remind me of bands like Yes, and with all the crazy energy and twists and turns to match. The title track just hits you with amazing hook after amazing hook, just keeping you guessing where it might go next and remaining thoroughly exciting all the way through like a roller coaster ride. Cloudburst Flight provides some more solid hooks and a comparatively more stripped back moment for the album, and Through Metamorphic Rocks has lots of other synth-heavy build-ups to give the album a climactic finish. This album's already plenty well loved as is, and that's clearly for good reason. I cannot disagree with any bit of the hype it's amassed. I just happen to hold the remaining 5 albums in their catalog a little closer to me on a personal level, so let's get into those. At number 5, I have Phaedra. Alright, I think we can all pretty much agree on this one's classic status. It was basically the first album to break electronic music out to a more mainstream audience months before Kraftwerk would release Autobahn, really demonstrating to more people than ever the true viability of music entirely made out of synthesizers. And just like Zeit, it still holds up and feels forward-thinking and easily accessible to this day. But where Zeit may have evoked the cold emptiness of space, this kind of evokes a similar cosmic theme in a much more easily approachable way. Driven entirely by simple looping sequencers, strange and otherworldly melodic effects, and plenty more mellotrons, even a bit of flutes and woodwinds as a bonus, all really hitting on a warm but lonely and science fiction-y sort of ambience. They were still figuring out what they were doing at this point. Some of the sequencer sounds on this album can occasionally feel a little unstable thanks to some subtle, pitch shifting caused by their equipment overheating. I'd argue Rubicon was the point at which they first approached the sound with full confidence, but that slightly less polished and more minimalistic approach I think actually helps add to the charm and emotional depth of this one even more. It was one of my most common go-to TD projects when I was in the mood for them in high school. It remained that way in the following years. It's absolutely one of, if not just the first project I'd recommend for someone looking to get initiated into Tangerine Dream, at least for those who really want to understand their unignorable importance in the history of this genre. Although, over the years since my first getting into this band in high school, whenever I'd personally be in the mood for some earlier period TD, I'd be much more likely to put on this next one. Whoopsh. At number 4, I have Stratosphere. As great as albums like Phaedra and Zeit are, showing electronic music itself in its infancy, but in such a way that still feels important and meaningful in present day, I feel like this was the point at which TD really nailed down the signature sound they're known for. Previous albums are easily recognizable as classic 70s Berlin School ambience, but Stratosphere is easily recognizable as Tangerine Dream specifically. An album that only this band would make and wouldn't be mistaken for any of their contemporaries on the scene, like Klaus Schulze, Vangelis, Kraftwerk, then newcomer Jean-Michel Jarre, or any number of others. It may not be their most impressive from a production standpoint. The whole project purposefully has the feeling of like a dry and deserted wasteland and can sound rather thin. But what makes this album great is the pacing and structuring. It's their first step away from the improvisational approach that colored all their previous albums, and into a new style that feels much more carefully planned out, with tracks feeling much more tightly structured with more accessible and catchy tunes and melodies. And unlike so many other TD albums where one half is markedly stronger than the other, Stratosphere's 4 tracks all feel exactly equal in importance. Title track is definitely my favorite, has the strongest and most exciting tune of all of them, but the other 3 each add something crucial to the experience and context. I do think other later albums of theirs even further improved upon the ideas this one set into motion, but out of their big, obvious 70s classics, this is definitely the one I've personally listened to the most frequently over the years. So as for the ones that improved upon it in my eyes, let's get into those next. Whoopsh. At number 3, I have Hyperborea. Judging from some of the comments I've gotten, this album placing so high in the ranking might be more of an uncommon take than I would have thought when I reviewed it. But whatever, I have to be honest to my tastes and say this is one of my most replayed TD albums ever. This was the final album the band released on Virgin Records, and in my opinion, the last noticeable step forward for the band on a technical level, as they started to focus on molding their synths into new shapes and organic arrangements not heard in quite the same way on any previous projects. The textures being explored on this album are so interesting and well layered, with all the strong and emotionally resonant tunes you'd want out of them, and I can't even pick one favorite track on this album because I enjoy all four on an exactly equal level for completely different reasons. The well-detailed No Man's Land, which molds its synths to sound like an electronic raga or something and best demonstrates their new steps forward in sound design. The Icy and Melancholy title track with its two interlocking halves being the biggest emotional heavy hitters. The bright and cheerful Cinnamon Road, which provides such a welcome burst of energy with loads of sitar-like synths. And finally, of course, the 20-minute epic Sphinx Lightning, which feels like it's bringing in elements from every previous album they put out in their whole Virgin Records era, but also kind of turns them into its own thing as well. It does seem like a surprising amount of fans just didn't really care too deeply about this album and felt like their style was getting a little old hat by this point in history. And given my thoughts on White Eagle, I guess I can kind of understand that to some degree. But to me, this was the last hurrah for that most forward-thinking and game-changing era of the band, before their catalog would really start to slide off and get a lot sameier and more commercial. It really has something special to it that I can't get out of any other album. And even if this turns out to be the equivalent of me marking like Tour de France and Electric Cafe as among my personal favorite Kraftwerk albums, I'm going to stick by Hyperbury as one of the easiest TD albums for me personally to revisit. I was even considering putting it one more spot higher just thanks to the sheer amount of replay value I've gotten out of it over the years. Although I instead decided to lean on a bit more of an obvious pick for that next spot. Whoopsh. And number 2, I have Tangram. If you ask me what the best starting point for a newcomer looking to get into TD for the first time would be, I'd honestly have to go with this one. Tangram may not be among their most game-changing releases. Like I said earlier, Phaedra does a far better job of demonstrating the band's historical importance if you want to start there. But I think Tangram provides the most indicative and clear picture of the kind of band TD are at their core, while also being extremely easily accessible and a lot more so than most of the stuff they were doing in the 70s. But not so accessible to the point of being a sellout. Just a masterclass of instrumental synth music that hits that perfect balance between the band's trademark epic soundscapes and the much more pop-friendly side of their sound that would all but completely take over their style afterwards. Also clearly showing their close proximity to classic prog rock as well in the way the guitars are utilized here. The two side-along tracks have loads of interesting evolutions and distinct sections, the first side basically being made out of lots of different interconnecting synth-pop vignettes ranging from big and epic and propulsive to extremely stripped-back, warm and heartfelt, to even subtly strange and off-the-wall, like that one part with all the sparse metallic clanking, or that one little 10-second moment that sounds like a Revolutionary War marching band for some reason. And the second side will do a lot better for people looking for more of the open-ended jam session side to the band's style, still focusing on looping synth progressions that are easily catchy and memorable, but mostly using those as a backbone to do a lot of various soloing from all sorts of different synth sounds and other instruments. I feel like this album's got a little something for every part of their fan base. It just really takes you on such a journey and has so much great stuff to dig into and so many iconic moments all over it. And yeah, there is definitely some nostalgia bias for me here, considering it was only the second album from the band I ever heard, but it got me hooked on them pretty immediately and was what fully convinced me to dive even deeper to hear all their other classics. And I imagine it can pretty easily do the same for most people looking into this band for the first time as well. Although, this album wasn't my own starting point into the band. No, the album that first turned me into a Tangerine Dream fan is also what I decided as my number 1 pick. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have Exit. Look, like I said in the intro of this video, whatever album you happen to choose as your starting point is likely to inform your taste in what parts of the Tangerine Dream catalog you gravitate towards the most. When it comes to this band, nobody can ignore nostalgia bias. It'll always be inherently baked into whichever project a given fan chooses as their favorite, and it's already dictated a lot of how this ranking has played out so far. So I don't see any reason not to just let that nostalgia also dictate my number one pick. I won't act like Exit doesn't have its problems that would prevent certain sects of the fanbase from fully getting into it, not only due to being their most pop-friendly project yet and the one that least focused on the ambient soundscape style they really became revered for up to that point in time, or the much tighter and more concise song structures, or the extremely 80s synth palette that ties it to that particular era in 1981 when it came out, etc. Even I think the album is very middle-loaded, with its weakest moments being the lengthier opener and closer. People who've watched this entire series may have noticed that I have not scored a single Tangerine Dream album in the 9 out of 10 range or higher. As many projects this band has made that I love, I wouldn't say they've done something truly transcendent or properly life-changing for me. Still, Exit is definitely the closest they came to that honor, regardless of any problems I might have with it or that I would understand other people having with it. There was just something so mesmerizing about it that lodged itself in my life really quickly. This album really won me over quickly as like a longtime Kraftwerk fan. It's by far the most Kraftwerk-ish album the band ever made. Not just in its particular proto-techno sound, but also in its feeling like it's looking ahead to the future with equal amounts of optimism and trepidation, very much in the exact same vein as Computer World. Pretty much the only other album I know of in existence to fully hit on the exact same appeal as that album, of reminding us how the present we live in right now felt like science fiction back then. But this album also wins because, in my opinion, it has all the very best hooks and melodies the band ever came up with by a fairly significant margin. Pilots of Purple Twilight and the title track are perfect futuristic mood pieces that get stuck in the head so easily. Network 23 feels like one of the first real techno songs ever, and exemplifies of what a lot of that genre is still all about to this day. Freaking Choranzon is like the catchiest track the band ever wrote. I've also come around on remote viewing a lot more recently, since even if there's no hook to that one, it still has a lot of cool futuristic ambience. It might not be the most indicative look of what Tangerine Dream are all about, but it's always the first thing I think about when I think about the band in passing, and it's unquestionably the album of theirs I've listened to the most frequently, and it's not even close. Exit may not hold this number one spot by very much. I get the people who don't care for it and it's got a lot of competition, but I still consider it an absolute classic and a must-listen, and it's always been my default answer for my favorite TD album in years previous, so I just decided to go with what I know. So there we go, Exit, my personal favorite Tangerine Dream album. And that is finally it. That's the ranking, and that is all the Tangerine Dream discussion I'm going to be doing for this channel. I really need to listen to some music that doesn't sound anything like Tangerine Dream. I might have slightly burnt myself out on this band a little bit, as is kind of inevitable for a series that has gone on as long as this one. I'm thinking my next two discography reviews are going to be a heck of a lot shorter than this one. And as for the next one, I'm feeling I have to focus on something that's about as far in the opposite of tone and energy level from this band as I can get. Perhaps a band known for being way more aggressive and loud, and whose game-changing status is associated with a completely different decade. I wonder what could fit for that. What was that? Whatever. Pay close attention to this channel for that coming soon. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave your comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.